warned of a growing al-Qaeda presence. The central government, in office for a month, appeared too weak to do much about it. Al-Qaeda had recently called for attacks on Americans as the anniversary of September 11 approached. Chris had asked the State Department for more security for the Benghazi mission, but it had been denied. On the evening of the 11th, an al-Qaeda offshoot attacked the main U.S. mission compound in Benghazi and a CIA annex about a mile away with grenades, RPGs, mortars, and automatic rifles. The attackers entered the building where Chris was hiding, poured gasoline, and torched it. Chris was killed, as was an embassy information officer, Sean Smith. Two former Navy SEALs helping to evacuate Americans at the CIA annex, Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods, were subsequently killed. Libyans discovered Chris's body, believed him to be alive, and tried to rescue him. He was pronounced dead at the hospital from smoke inhalation. I heard about what had happened the same way most Americans did, from news reports. In those first days after his death, I was just terribly saddened by it. I wasn't angry with the administration. I remember listening to Secretary Clinton's memorial remarks about him and being very moved by them, and I asked Chris Brose to send her a note of thanks. I started to get angry when it appeared administration officials were knowingly misleading us about the attack, attributing it to a video that some idiot had made mocking Islam that incited a spontaneous mob that turned violent. It took more than a week for the White House to acknowledge it had been a planned terrorist attack. The uproar that ensued became a lasting political controversy that's still debated. I was one of the most vocal critics, calling the administration's analysis willful ignorance or abysmal intelligence, and a massive cover-up or incompetence. I demanded that a special committee investigate it. In the end, all it established is what could have been presumed at the beginning: bureaucratic incompetence and ass covering, two common conditions in Washington. Anger subsides, politics move on, but sadness remains. Chris Stevens deserved better from all of us. And what of the country he died trying to help? It disintegrated into anarchy as warring militias clashed, politicians feuded, rival legislators contested for control, and ISIS exploited the chaos to establish a franchise operation in the country. Libyans who were ecstatic over their enfranchisement in 2012 showed up in reduced numbers to vote in 2014, half as many as 2 years before. The U.S. and Europe, having intervened to change the regime, disengaged from the urgent, complex task of transforming a terrorized nation into a functioning civil society, of helping Libyans build national institutions where none existed. A UN-brokered agreement in 2015 called for a new government of national accord and a new constitution and election that various warring factions continued to hinder. ISIS lost its territory but remains a presence. Last September, a new UN reconciliation plan was announced. A little hopefulness flickers in the embers that the worst might be behind. The memory of the heady optimism of 2011 that gave way quickly to resignation and despair cautions against great expectations. But that's not to say there are no Libyans left who believe in the promise of 2011. There are many who still have faith they are capable of building a modern democracy. I do too. I've met them and been inspired by them and believe in them. They need other Libyans to believe in their future too, and assistance from the West to help them build it. They need guidance and resources and security. They need time. They need the generosity and vision of Chris Stevens, reflected in the efforts of those who emulate the example of that good man. As NATO contemplated whether to intervene in Libya in March 2011, the first large protests in Syria began in provincial towns. 15 kids were arrested in Dera in the southwest corner of the country for scrawling anti-regime graffiti on school walls. Protesters marched to demand their release. Government security forces opened fire on them, killing several. More protesters marched in response, and police fired on them too, killing scores. Protests proliferated nationwide, as did demands for Bashar al-Assad's resignation. The regime responded to the demonstrations with force. The casualties climbed, as Alawite Assad made war on the majority of his countrymen, who were Sunni. 100,000 demonstrated in Homs, the country's third-largest city. By the summer, as many as 1 million Syrians were marching. The regime was using tanks to put down the protest. The U.S. and Europe imposed sanctions on the regime. President Obama called for Assad to step down. Syrian army officers defected and formed the Free Syrian Army, FSA, and civil war ensued. In January 2012, they were fighting in the Damascus suburbs. In February, the army began shelling Homs, starting the offensive to retake the city that would kill thousands, and was described by an evacuated British journalist as a scene of medieval siege and slaughter. In May, pro-regime forces executed over 100 Syrians, most of them women and children, in the town of Taldu in the Hula region of Syria. Syria's descent into hell was nearing the point of no return when I spoke on the Senate floor in March 2012 to argue for arming the Free Syrian Army and call for airstrikes by the U.S. and our European and regional allies to ground the Syrian Air Force, which was indiscriminately bombing population centers. I proposed creating safe havens for opposition